The most powerful man in China died far away from his capital, but for weeks, no one was allowed to say he was dead. The empire kept moving, kept obeying, kept bowing to a man who was already gone. And the people around him made a decision that changed Chinese history forever. They ordered wagons of salted fish to ride alongside his carriage, because the smell of rotting fish was less suspicious than the smell of a rotting emperor. To understand why his death had to be hidden, you first need to understand who he was. This was not just a king. This was Qin Shi Huang, the man who did something no one in Chinese history had ever managed to do. Qin Shi Huang was born as Ying Zheng, king of a fractured land where China did not exist as one country, but as 7 kingdoms, each with its own army, its own currency, its own set of laws, and centuries of hatred toward the others. Generals fought over rivers. Farmers died in wars that had been dragging on longer than anyone could remember. The land was fractured, exhausted, and bleeding. And then one kingdom swallowed all of them. In 221 BC, the king of Qin finished what his ancestors had started. He crushed the last of the rival states, unified the land under a single authority, and decided that the title of king was simply not enough for what he had done. So he invented a new one. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the man who ended 5 centuries of war and stitched an entire civilization back together by force of will and an extraordinary appetite for control. What drove him was not cruelty, even though cruelty was part of it. What drove him was a terror of disorder. He had grown up watching kingdoms collapse, watching power shift like sand, watching strong men get outmaneuvered and destroyed. He was determined that would never happen to him, and even more determined it would never happen to what he built after he was gone. So he standardized everything he could reach: the currency, the writing system, the measurements used by merchants across thousands of miles, the roads his armies traveled, the laws his courts enforced. He built walls to keep threats out and roads to pull his empire together, and when people resisted, he buried them or burned their books, or both. He was not governing China so much as he was fusing it at the seams with iron and fire, making it impossible to pull apart again. He was also terrified of dying. He sent expeditions to search for an elixir of immortality. He consumed mercury-based concoctions that his physicians believed prolonged life and that almost certainly shortened it. He built himself a tomb so enormous, so obsessively detailed, that it took hundreds of thousands of workers decades to complete an entire underground empire waiting for him on the other side. He prepared for death with the same obsessive energy he brought to everything, while refusing to accept it was actually coming. In 210 BC, he was on one of his inspection tours, moving through the eastern provinces of his empire. These journeys mattered to him. He wanted to see his land, and he wanted to see his land, and he wanted his land to see him, that living reminder of what had been built and what would happen if anyone thought about undoing it. Somewhere along that road in the summer heat, his health collapsed. His physicians could not bring him back, and the man who had spent his entire reign making himself impossible to question quietly stopped breathing. The emperor was dead, and the men riding with him had maybe a few hours to decide what that meant for the rest of the world. His chief eunuch Zhao Gao and his prime minister Li Si understood something with terrifying clarity in that moment. The emperor's authority was the only thing holding the empire together. His laws, his roads, his walls, his unified currency, all of it rested on the assumption that he was alive and watching and ready to respond. The second that assumption broke, every general with ambitions, every noble family that had been crushed under Qin rule, every region that had been forced into this empire against its will, all of them would move at once, so they sealed the carriage. They told the guards that the emperor was resting and would receive no visitors. They kept the procession moving at the same pace, along the same route, stopping at the same places it had always planned to stop. And they began issuing orders in his name, forging his seal on documents, responding to reports from the capital as though his hand was still guiding every decision. For weeks, the most powerful empire in the ancient world was being administered by 2 men pretending to be one dead one. And it was working. The summer heat was the problem they had not fully accounted for. A body does not keep in that climate, not over that kind of distance, not over that kind of time. The solution they arrived at was one of the stranger details in the history of power: wagons loaded with salted fish, ordered to travel directly alongside the imperial carriage at all times. The smell of the fish covered what was happening inside. The procession continued. Officials filed their reports. The empire kept obeying, but while the procession kept moving, Zhao Gao was already making his real move. He intercepted letters meant for the Crown Prince Fusu, forged a decree in the emperor's name ordering him to take his own life, and Fusu, unable to imagine his father was already dead, obeyed. He never knew the throne had been taken from him before he even knew it was his. And that is the real tragedy underneath all of it. Qin Shi Huang built an empire so dependent on one man's authority that it had no way of surviving without him. The very thing that made it powerful made it fragile. His officials had to keep pretending he was alive because the system he designed gave them no other option. Within 15 years of his death, the dynasty he named after himself was gone, consumed by exactly the kind of chaos he had spent his entire life trying to prevent. This pattern appears more often in history than most people realize. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, he left behind an empire with no designated heir and generals who had spent decades learning from the most aggressive military mind in the ancient world. The result was 40 years of wars between those generals, each carving out their own kingdom from what had been won. When a system is built around one extraordinary person and that person disappears, what comes next is almost always the same story: the scramble, the betrayal, the collapse of whatever they swore to protect. The difference with Qin Shi Huang is that his collapse was hidden long enough to make it worse. By the time anyone admitted what had happened, the wrong decisions had already been made, the wrong people had already been killed, and the wrong man was already sitting on the throne.